Tonight we're in episode 4 of our series that we've been going through the past month in the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. So if you have your Bible with you or if you have your phone, you can turn there. Also on the screen we will have the verses as well. Ecclesiastes in chapter 3 and chapter 4. And I want to say, which I've been saying recently, if you have not downloaded our app yet, download it. And you can click on the sermon notes there and follow along with not only the passages, but with a lot more information as well. So we're in this series entitled Under the Sun, and tonight we're going to go on a quest for answers concerning justice. The big questions of life. The questions that many of us have asked time and time again. And I want to quote Angelina Jolie. Here's what she says. "The side of fairy tales I don't like is that they always have happy endings. That there's just good and evil and things are perfect. But life is a little more complicated, and that's what I try to teach my kids." That's true, right? That life is more complicated than simple good and evil. It's much more gray. There's so many twists and turns in life. And one of the things that's true about fairy tales or superhero movies is that as you're watching them go through the drama or the tension or the suffering in the story, you may feel it, you may journey with them, but you kind of know that they're going to make it to the end. They cannot die because they're the protagonist, and everything needs to work out in the end, or nobody will like the movie. And so you can journey with them because you know it's going to be okay. It's going to be a happy ending. It's all going to work out. There may be some casualties, but not the main person. The main person's going to make it through. Now, in your life, as you're the main character of your life, you don't have that vantage point. And so you don't feel that. It's hard to trust that promise in Romans 8 that God is working everything for good because you don't have the vantage point of knowing whether or not things are going to go the way that you desire. Because we live in a world where the good guys don't always get what they deserve and the bad guys are not always punished. We know that. Life is much more complicated than a simple fairy tale with a happy ending. Verse 16 of Ecclesiastes 3, the preacher, the Koheleth, who's the writer here, guiding us on this quest, he says this, "Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness." He's speaking about the complicated nature and the harsh reality of life. That where there's supposed to be justice, he found wickedness. Where there's supposed to be righteousness, he found wickedness. That life is a struggle. It is complicated. And one of the things that is true for each and every one of us is that we desire in our soul to live under and to operate within a just system. We desire justice. However, we've never lived in that system. We've never experienced it fully. We've experienced moments of justice, but so much of our life is characterized by injustice. Raise your hand if you've asked this question, okay? And I want you to raise your hand. How many of you have asked this? How can a good, loving, and powerful God allow evil, suffering, and injustice in the world? Have you ever asked that question? Raise your hand if you've asked that. Okay, I know everyone has. Some of you are a little nervous. Like, is it okay to ask that question? Yes, it's okay. I've asked the question. We all have asked this question. How come God, who is loving and good and powerful, how come he allows injustice and evil and suffering? This is one of the great philosophical questions of the past few centuries. I think that humanity has been asking this question for thousands of years, but that question is attributed to David Hume. And we've been asking it. It's a philosophical question that we've been wrestling through. And I don't want to get into the weeds of that tonight. So I told you I was going to talk about team night. On Tuesday night, that's what we're going to discuss. That question. How can a good, powerful, and loving God allow suffering and evil? 7 p.m., right in the back. We're going to discuss it. And here's the thing. I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen, but there's going to be an experiment that is going to be awesome. And you just got to be a part of it. That's the teaser. I can't give it away. It's a cliffhanger, okay? But we're going to wrestle through that question together on Tuesday night. But that question, that philosophical question about a good, loving, powerful God, why could he allow evil and suffering? It leads to another dimension of our quest for answers concerning justice. And that is the personal nature of that. We can debate the philosophical question, but we feel that question personally, deeply. In particular, if you're in a moment of suffering right now, if you just came out of a moment of suffering, if your loved one is suffering, now you really feel that question and you're wondering why. Why under the sun must we experience this? Look what verse 17 says. Ecclesiastes 3 says, I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. See, sometimes we respond to that philosophical and personal nature of our quest for answers concerning justice with, well, God is sovereign, he is in control, and there's a time for everything. We may agree with that, we may desire to believe that, but there's still a question, if we're honest, behind that. And that's what is happening here in the passage. He's saying that life is complicated. Where there was righteousness, I saw wickedness. Where there was justice, I saw wickedness. And yet, I know that God is in control of all things, and there's a time and a season for everything, and God is the judge, and he will judge the wicked and the righteous. However, the question that we really feel that he's going to get into, and we're going to explore together, is why the delay, God? Yes, you're the judge. Yes, there's a time and a season for everything, but why is the present time not the right time for justice? Why is the present time not the right time for the restoration of broken things? Why are we waiting? Why are we living in this harsh reality under the sun? And so he gives an answer actually in the next verse, which is quite abrasive. And he says this in verse 18, I said in my heart, with regard to the children of man, that God is testing, or the word in Hebrew is exposing. God is exposing them that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. Wow. Okay. His response to the questions concerning justice as he's trying to find answers, God, why is the right time, why is the present time not the right time for justice? How come life is so complicated? How come there's so much injustice? He pivots on the question and he says, we shouldn't be asking ourselves or asking God questions. Instead, we should reflect upon ourselves. And as I reflected upon myself, I realized that myself and everybody else is but a beast. Now, he's going to say why he believes this is the answer. And it's because he believes that we are the same as a beast, meaning our end is the same. We are mortal. We live, we die. He says, from the dust we came, to the dust we shall return. We follow a similar pattern of life, and so we are but beasts under the sun. The next few verses, he says this, 19 through 21. He says, for what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast. For all is vanity, all is temporary, all is vapor. All go to one place, all are from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward, and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth. So here's what he's saying here. He's saying, I'm thinking and I'm processing as I'm searching for justice, and I'm wondering why the world is such a harsh reality, why there is so much injustice. And I began to look at myself and look at other people, and I said, we're all but beasts. We all just are living our life, but we're going to die and we're going to go to dust, and we all have the same fate, and life is just a vapor. It's temporary. It's vanity. But then he asks a question at the very end, which is so important to see. Verse 21, he says, but who knows if the soul or the spirit of man or humanity goes upward and the soul or spirit of beast or creatures goes downward? He's questioning eternity. This is one of the really interesting things about us as human beings. We all ponder and question eternity. Every one of us. Every single faith, every single person is questioning eternity. Consider the three monotheistic religions, the belief in one God: Christians, Jews, Muslims. They believe that your soul is eternal. We believe that your soul is eternal, and that is supported by sacred scriptures that we believe are authoritative in truth. Polytheist, Hindus, they believe that the soul is eternal, reincarnation of the soul into being, supported by sacred scriptures. Those that believe in the self, for instance, Buddhists, they believe in the eternity of realms that the soul is going through, supported by their scriptures. Even atheists who do not believe in God and do not believe in afterlife and do not believe in eternity, they believe that. Why? Supported by their scientific sacred scriptures. But they believe in the eternity of the universe. Isn't it so interesting that every single person, regardless of your beliefs, believes in eternity in some fashion? Whether for the soul, for the created world and matter. In fact, what's so interesting to me about the new atheism movement is that there are so many new atheists that are excited to kind of combat the idea of eternity and the belief in eternity, and to say that there's no way it's possible, even though they believe in the eternity of the universe. And they must answer the same way he says in verse 21 when questioned about eternity, which is, who knows? Because our vantage point is bound by space and time. And the reason he's getting at this is because in this chapter, in verse 11, he says that God has done something in your heart and in my heart, and that is, he has placed eternity there. In your heart and in my heart and in every heart of every person you've ever met, there is eternity. There is that question of eternity. There is that sense of eternity. And this connects to our concerns with justice. Because each and every one of us feels deeply that there is some standard of justice that has been rebelled against when we see oppression, when we see pain, when we see suffering, when we see evil. There's some eternal standard of justice, and we sense deeply that that is not how things are meant to be. That is not how people are to be treated. That is not what human rights are about. But where do we get that? Where do we have that understanding? This eternal sense of justice that every person feels. It's because God has placed eternity within our heart. C.S. Lewis has a great quote on the matter, and he says this. He says, "A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is." See, the reason that we have so many questions about the injustice and evil of the world is because God has placed that eternal sense of justice, his standard, into our heart. And we sense that. However, as we saw in Romans chapter 1, as we went through that book over the summer, Romans chapter 1 says that we have exchanged the truth of God for a lie. We have exchanged the truth of God for a lie. And so here's what happens, and here's why we live in this difficult reality. We create systems of justice that fit our desires and our priorities. Because we all have that eternal sense of justice within our heart, and yet we've exchanged the truth of God for a lie, so we create and we try to mold a standard of justice that is somehow reflective in nature to God's eternal justice, but is still fitting our priorities and is fitting our comfort. Every culture does this. Every system that you operate under does this. It's submitting in some way, it's connected in some way to God's eternal justice, but we have exchanged the truth of God for a lie, so we create a system that fits our priorities and our comforts. And then we do something too, and we see this a lot. Anyone that disagrees with our standard of justice, we label beasts, or we at least treat them like that. This is exactly what he's getting at here in Ecclesiastes 3, the reality that we live in and why things are so harsh and difficult for us. The psalmist speaks about the same thing. He says this in Psalm 49:12. He says, man, as he speaks about man, he's using that word in Hebrew for mankind, men and women. It's not just you men, okay? Man in his pomp will not remain. He is like the beast that perish. Connecting to the same thing that the preacher says here in Ecclesiastes. The people that are like beasts are men and women of pomp. The next few verses, 14b in Psalm 49, he says, death shall be their shepherd, and the upright shall rule over them in the morning. Their form shall be consumed in Sheol, that's the grave, with no place to dwell. See, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, as he's speaking about the reality that we are like beasts and the difficulty and the struggle of this world and the injustice of this world is because we are beastly. He is connecting that and speaking in the same way that the psalmist in Psalm 49 is saying that men and women of pomp are like beasts. This is the beastly path. And when you follow this, when you are a person of pomp, he says that death is your shepherd and you're digging your own grave. Sheol is your life. And the preacher in Ecclesiastes 3 is processing all of this, and then he shares in verse 22 what you can experience and what you can hope for in this life if you're following this beastly path. In verse 22, he says this, so I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Just what he does on this earth, temporary, fleeting, vain. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? Even though we have eternity in our heart, our fixation is on the things of this earth, right? We feel deeply that the things of this earth matter. The way we treat people, the way we engage in business, the way that we operate in the world, the way that systems are run for the benefit of all. We feel deeply that the things of this earth matter, but they only matter if there's eternity. If there's no eternity, they don't matter. It's just survival of the fittest. And as he's saying this, he's saying that the people that follow this beastly path, that are fixated only on this earth, that have exchanged the truth of God for a lie, they have some sense of justice, but they've created a standard of justice that operates for their benefit, because they're people of pomp, that all they can expect in this life is to hear a job well done in their work, in their toil, to hear good father, good mother, good coworker, good boss. And though these things matter and these things are encouraging and are great experiences, nobody wants to believe or sense that their entire life is just about receiving job well done here and there. That it's just about what you can do and receive in terms of praise or acknowledgement in your work here. This is the reality of living in a broken world, that so many of us, instead of considering eternity that's been placed in our heart and submitting ourselves to the eternal standard of justice that God has set for us, we've created our own path and we've just kind of accepted the reality that our lot in life is just to try to do as best as we can in our work, in our relationships, in our life, so that we can feel like we've been successful, that we've did a good job. That's the harsh reality of a broken world. And the problem is we live in a complicated world where life is not always good. And what we think we're going to attain, because we're really working hard, we don't always attain. And in the church, we time and time talk about like the brokenness of the world. And here's how it typically goes. We live in a world that is broken, in a world full of injustice. Why? Because of sin. That's the answer. And so it kind of goes like this. Because of sin, the world is broken. As an example, natural disasters. The universe is broken because of sin. Rogue asteroids, black holes digesting matter into oblivion. That's like terrifying. We know that systems are broken and advantage some and disadvantage others. We know that other people are broken. We experience that all the time. And we also know that we ourselves are broken in the way that we treat people, in the way that we act. We know that our bodies are broken, and we only know that more with age. Our minds are fractured and broken. We know that we're broken. And we say all the time, it's because of sin. And that is the right answer, but we should go deeper. You can't just sit there and that's no comfort, that's no journey, that's no path for you to navigate the complexity of this world by just saying, well, there's injustice and the world is broken because of sin. We had to peel a layer back. So in chapter 4, verse 1 and 2, very next chapter, the preacher says this, "Again I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed. They had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppression, there was power, and there was no one to comfort them." There's no one to comfort them. The world is broken because of sin. But here's the question. What fuels injustice? He answers it. Did you catch it? Power. Oppression is always on the side of power. Power is a breeding ground for injustice. He's saying that the oppressed have no one to comfort them for their tears because those in power are the ones that oppress, strip them of that opportunity. There's a 19th century British politician that has a quote that I know most of you have heard. It says this, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts." What does it say? Absolutely. You're like, amen. Unless you have the power, then you're like, I don't know. Because power breeds oppression. It's what fuels injustice. In fact, the Bible is ripe with examples of this, the corrupting nature of power. Chief among them, the death of Jesus. Jesus was innocent, he committed no crimes, and yet he was sentenced to death. Why? Because of power. Because the religious leaders were afraid that he would take power from them. Even Pontius Pilate knows that Jesus is innocent, and yet he condemns him to death. Why? To maintain power. What fuels injustice? The preacher here in Ecclesiastes 4, and we would know from our experience too, is the obsession that we have with power. It breeds this harsh reality. And so he says, as he reflects upon this, verse 3, "But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not yet seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun." His response to all of this is, it's better for those that have not yet been born to experience the difficulty of this world, consumed and obsessed with obtaining power, with injustice, with evil, with oppression, with all of these realities. Because men of pomp and women of pomp have not surrendered to eternity that has been placed in their heart. They have rejected the eternal standard of justice that God has set forth, and yet create systems for themselves where power becomes the prize. And when power becomes the prize of your life, it will give you false hope and false freedom. If I just have this kind of power in my job, this kind of power in a relationship, this kind of power in the city, this kind of power in the country, then I would do A, B, and C, and I would feel free. That when power becomes the prize, it's really dangerous, because not only does it lead you to the possibility and the temptation of you oppressing other people and inflicting injustice upon other people, that what you will find in time is that your own soul will face tragedy and evil and suffering, because power is dangerous. Jesus preaches against it and preaches of its temptation time and time again. And he says there in Psalm 49, which is like haunting me all week, that when you're a man and a woman of pomp and death is your lot in life, that it becomes your shepherd, becomes the one that guides you. And you think you're ascending, you think you're digging or you're building your life up, but in fact, you're actually digging your own grave. You're digging a life to Sheol. But here's a question. What leads to the pursuit of power. Why do we pursue that? See, one of the things that I want to warn you against, as I had to warn myself against this week, we hear this, read Ecclesiastes 3 and 4, read Psalm 49, we think about someone else. Maybe you've been doing that all night. You're thinking about somebody else who's not using power well, who it's corrupting them. Have you thought about yourself? Because we're all tempted by power. We're all obsessed with obtaining power in some way. And it can happen in large and small ways. It can happen in your company. It can happen within a community. It can happen within a friend group. It can happen within your family. It can happen in the city. And guess what? It can happen in the church. The obsession with power. And what you find is that death becomes your shepherd. And injustice quickly follows. That's why we see things like this. I wrote a few things down. That's why we see in the world people who justify oppression for personal gain. Because once power becomes your prize, it's very hard to let it go. We see that people overlook injustice if it maintains their sense of comfort. Because people don't want to let go of power. And also, we see that so many ignore the cries of those in pain because it's not their pain. See, death becomes your shepherd, and you begin to dig a grave for yourself. You live like a beast. In Ecclesiastes chapter 9, the preacher here says that we are people with madness in our heart. Madness. There's an author, Francis Spufford, who says this. I love this quote. He says, "We are creatures who don't get to decide what we are, whose natures are always partially hidden from our conscious understanding, who always pull several ways at once. Whenever the line is drawn between acceptable and unacceptable, between kind and cruel, between clean and dirty, we're always going to be voting on both sides of it, despite ourselves." See, you may be thinking, I was coming to church for like an encouraging message tonight. But listen, we have to be honest with ourselves. This is our nature. Though life is complicated, we are also complicated. We desire justice. We desire to live in a just system, though we've never experienced it. And in our past, in our present, and we will not in our future until Jesus returns. We desire that. And we always have the tendency to put ourselves on the side of the good guy, when in fact we are complicated. It's not just the world, we are complicated. We are both just at times and unjust. We are kind and we are cruel. We are good and we are bad. We are all of these things wrapped up because we live in a broken world because of sin, and because what fuels so many of us and the temptation for each and every one of us is power. We see that from the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, the desire for power. It's there within us. And so there's a temptation when we fixate on this earth, instead of surrendering to the very God who put eternity within our heart, there's a temptation to follow this beastly path and to begin digging a hole for our lives. And all we're going to get out of it is a job well done in a few different areas of our life. But that is not the path that you're meant to walk. That is not the life that you're meant to live. That's not who you've been designed by God to be. You're not called to be a man and woman of pomp and like a beast. Not at all. Jesus gives this parable, and he speaks about a field. And I want you to track with me here. Jesus says that there's an owner who has a field. And he says that in the field there's wheat, and you'll see that there will be weeds. The owner owns the field, and he plants all of this wheat to cultivate. He hires some farmers that will work within the field. But one night, when no one is looking, an enemy comes and begins to plant weeds within the field. So the farmers are working the field, and they begin to notice that as the wheat begins to grow, which is good, healthy, right, it's what's supposed to be in the field, that there are weeds growing alongside of it. And the farmers are concerned. These are not supposed to be here. The field is not supposed to have weeds. It's not its intention. So they go back to the owner of the field. They go, we got a problem. There's weeds and there's wheat. They're growing together. So here's what we're going to do. We got the solution. We're going to go in the field and we're going to rip out all the weeds. Restore the field to its proper function. And the owner says, no, you are not. Because you may think you're doing the right thing, but I know you are not capable of distinguishing between the weeds and the wheat. And you will sometimes, in haste, pull out the wheat instead of the weeds. You're going to do more harm than good if you go try to restore my field. I will restore my field. You keep tending to it. And trust me that I know how to harvest at the proper time. So the farmers go and listen. Now, I was thinking about it this week. Imagine being with some of those farmers. You're sitting there thinking to yourself, does he even care about the field? Like, why is he letting the weeds grow? Why doesn't he restore it right now? Why doesn't he rip out all the weeds today? Why is he delaying? It had to have been so frustrating for them to wait, for him to cultivate that field at the right time. See, this is our existence. Jesus gives this parable, it's so helpful for us. We live in the field. This is God's, this earth, this universe is God's. He is cultivating it. And he has planted wheat. There is good that is growing within your own soul if you've surrendered to Christ, and there is good that is growing in this world, but there are weeds. And those weeds are tangled within everything. They're tangled around us. And we want to go to God and say, God, don't you care? What are you doing? And God says, no, you cannot restore this field to its proper function. I will do that. You cultivate to the best of your ability. You take care of the wheat. You try to foster and grow the wheat, the good, as best as you can. And trust me that I will restore it to its proper function in its proper time. You see, what Jesus wants us to learn, which is connected to Ecclesiastes 3 and 4 and Psalm 49, is that he knows better than we. He knows better than we do. And listen, sometimes we sit there and we say, does God care? Why the delay? Why does God, in the present time, not just restore everything to its proper function? You know that God is more offended by injustice than you? Because we, in our oppression, in our pursuit of power, and the pain that we inflict upon other people, and the injustice that we see in the world, guess whose standard of justice we are breaking? It's not some system in the world. It's God's, the eternal one that's been placed within our heart. He is much more offended. He is much more harmed. He is much more saddened when we rebel against his sense of justice, and yet he knows better than we. So what do? Well, one, we pray and we advocate for justice. Not thinking that we can be the ones that can restore the entire field to its proper function, but knowing, just like the owner says to the farmers, hey, you cultivate it, you focus on your plot, and you do what you can to the best of your ability. I will handle the removal of the weeds in its proper time. So you can grieve over injustice. You should be praying for justice, advocating for it, but know that God knows better than you or me. And in our haste at times, we may do more harm than good when we're not surrendered to him. And then secondly, we should trust him in every season. It's a dominant theme of chapter 3 in Ecclesiastes, is that God is sovereign over everything. There's a time and a season for everything. And that we should trust God as the owner of the field, recognizing our place. There's something right that the preacher does in Ecclesiastes 3, which is to remember that we are different from God. We are the farmers, we are not the owner. And we should trust him. And we can trust him, why? Because God is not unaffected by injustice. His standard is being breached, and secondly, he knows injustice. You see, God the Father sent Jesus the Son to face the injustice of the cross, to satisfy that eternal standard of justice so that you could be restored into a relationship with God. He knows injustice. The justice of God required the injustice of the cross. The justice of God required the injustice of the cross. God knows injustice. Jesus Christ experienced it on the cross for you. So whenever you're sitting there and you think, God doesn't care, he's not concerned, how could he possibly empathize with me in my struggle, in my difficulty, in the injustice that I'm facing? Oh, he certainly can. Hebrews chapter 4 says that we have a great high priest that we can come to, whose name is Jesus, and he can empathize with us in our time of need because he was tempted and tried in every way that we are, even more so because he faced the injustice of the cross. You see, he understands. I want to close with a story from Corrie ten Boom in The Hiding Place. She recalls this interaction with her father because she's really nervous and anxious, rightfully so, about what would happen to her and her family if the Germans found them as they're hiding during World War II. She says this. It's a lesson that she learned from her father. Father sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. Corrie, he began gently, when you and I go to Amsterdam, when do I give you your ticket? I sniffed a few times, considering this. Why, just before we get on the train. Exactly. And our wise Father in heaven knows when we're going to need things too. Don't run out ahead of him. When the time comes that some of us will have to die, you will look into your heart and find the strength you need just in time. The world is difficult. It's a harsh reality. The injustice that we see, the injustice that we face. But see, the promise is that God is not removed from that. He empathizes and understands. In fact, he's in control of the field that is this world, and he will harvest at the proper time. And he will give you exactly what you need when you ask, which is strength and his love. See, in Psalm 49, where it's talking about the men of pomp and death is their shepherd and they're digging their own grave, in verse 15, the very next verse, it says this, but God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. You see, you can find hope in the midst of a difficult world, an unjust world, as you face suffering and evil and difficulty for yourself. Why? Because if you have surrendered to Jesus in faith, your soul has been ransomed from digging a grave, from Sheol. Your soul has been ransomed from death to life. Death is no longer your shepherd. Who is your shepherd? The Lord is your shepherd. And so you can find hope, you can find peace, you can find strength as you navigate the difficulty of this world because God is not removed. In fact, he's very close to you. And he has ransomed you to walk with you. I pray that that gives you hope this week, how God is working in your life and in the world, and that you would pray to advocate for justice and also to seek God when you need strength in the midst of difficulty.